Good morning, everyone. Thank you, thank you. And I know it's so hard to stop the talking because that's why we're all here, to talk and to network. But we have a very busy, very exciting day, so if we don't get started on time, we're not going to get out of here on time. So with that in mind, my name is Maria Vargas. I work at the U.S. Department of Energy. I'm the lead ambassador for DOE on C3E, and it is a pleasure to see all of you here today. So welcome to the second day of the C3E Symposium. We are delighted you are all here with us today. I just want to start with a couple thank yous. Thank you to MIT for this lovely event. And I was just asking my table, do you think we could open those windows? Because the Charles River, the view is to die for. So if we don't get to do it while we're in here, well, okay, but Sally's got slides, so maybe we'll do it after Sally's slides. But in any case, the venue is lovely, so thank you to Martha and Debbie and Kelly and the whole MIT team for pulling this together. I also want to say thank you to the sponsors. Those dinners last night, I hope many of you were able to take advantage of the networking dinners. I see lots of nods. They were just such a treat, and one of the things that makes the MIT Symposium so special. And our very capable MC at our table, where's Britt-eyed? There she is. One of the questions that she asked folks as we talked at our table last night was, tell me something you took away from the first day of the symposium. And I think almost without exception, everyone was Gina's optimism, right? It was Gina's. In fact, Britt said, okay, you can't say Gina anymore because give me something else. So I'm hoping that that carries on and something you can take with you from this symposium, because it's helpful for me too, because when you work on climate, it can be kind of bleak some days. There are some days where you bang your head against the wall. But so I hope that you all leave at the symposium with the enthusiasm and optimism that comes from not only meeting fellow women leaders in the space, but you leave with new connections to continue in our fight to protect the Earth's climate. So with that, okay. So my job today is very brief, but it's very fun. I get to introduce Sally Benson. Where's Sally? There she is. I'm like, I knew she was just there. You can all read Sally's bio on the web. So what I decided I'm going to do is tell you a story about Sally. And it's a true story. And that's what makes it all the more fun and I think impactful. So for those of you who don't know, I run an initiative at the U.S. Department of Energy. Even though I like to think of C3E as my day job, it's really something I get to do, not as part of my normal day, but I make it fit in because it's really a passion project for me. But at the Department of Energy, I run an initiative called the Better Buildings Initiative. And what we do, and what we've done for the past decade, is work with organizations who are willing to set portfolio-wide goals, and those for the past 10 years have been focused on energy efficiency. So we need people to make public goals on energy efficiency. They set an ambitious target, and then they share how they're doing it, right? So it's built on this market leadership theory of change. If you get the leaders to demonstrate and de-risk, we can really, because if everyone has to figure this out on their own, we're hosed. We're never going to get to our decarbonization goals. Okay, so you need that context for the story. Okay. So I'm a career federal employee, so regardless of who's at 1600 Pennsylvania, I show up at work. And not this administration, but the last administration. We were lucky because it was okay to work on energy efficiency, right? Because energy efficiency is a very strong foundation. It is really the strong foundation for climate change and decarbonization. And if we jump ahead to renewables, we're not going to meet our decarbonization goals. So take that home with you from the Department of Energy. Energy efficiency is the key first step. We have got to reduce our energy waste. Okay. But we've been working with organizations at a portfolio-wide level, right? So if you're Hilton, it's all your Hilton hotels. If you're Starbucks, it's all your Starbucks. You get the idea, these big organizations. And they were coming to me and saying, this is great, Maria, but we really want to work on greenhouse gas reductions. This is 5 years ago. This is the last administration, right? We weren't allowed to say climate. So I said, okay, that's great. How can we do this, right? So I kept trying to pitch these ideas and these programs at DOE. Well, how about if we do something on net zero? No, we don't like the term net zero. How about if we do something on climate adaptation? No, we don't like climate. Okay, so and then I kept thinking, well, how about carbon? Could we do something on carbon, right? Because we want to reduce our carbon emissions. And I kept saying no. And then I kept talking to our assistant secretary, and finally he said, well, I read this really interesting paper by this woman named Sally Benson. I'm like, Sally Benson? I said, really? He said, oh yeah, no, she's done some really interesting, really forward-thinking work on this topic. And I say, I know Sally Benson. Sally Benson, if I can get you on the phone with Sally Benson, could we talk through what might be possible? And he said, okay. So I call Sally. Thank God for the C3E network. So I call Sally Benson. I say, Sally, you got to do me a favor. Will you get on the phone? Because I keep getting no's, and maybe I can get to a yes. So Sally, being the gem she is, says, sure, I'll get on the phone. So sure enough, I set up a phone call. It wasn't even that long of a phone call, and Sally just talked. Sally had written a paper about an all-the-above approach to our energy future and really how to do it. Well, don't you know, the assistant secretary gets off the phone with Sally, and I got greenlit to do what became the low-carbon pilot at DOE, working with organizations, which then became the precursor to what we're doing now, which is the Better Climate Challenge, working with over 200 organizations. So that was because of Sally. So I just like to tell that story. Yay, Sally! Because I just think it's a true story. That's the cool part of that story. And I just think that Sally's role, her influence, the work she's done in this space really has provided the thought leadership that we've needed. And it's why they asked her to be part of this administration's Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. And now she's back at Stanford as a professor, but her influence and her thought leadership continues to shine no matter where she is. So with that, Sally Benson.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a funny story. I remember getting this call, and it's like, what? Anyway, whatever. We'll go with it. Anyway, thanks to Martha and the entire MIT team for the terrific work that you've done to pull this together. Of course, it's spectacular. Everything about it, the program, the people. So anyway, thanks for the opportunity to be here. As you can see from the title, I'm going to talk about all hands on deck, which really are my attempt to capture the reflections from spending the last 2 years at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, arguably the most consequential time in climate policy in the United States. So to give you a perspective of what I was working on, I worked very closely with the Climate Policy Office, with Gina's team, with the National Security Council, OMB, National Economic Council, Council on Environmental Quality. And so we were all a small team in the White House working together with the agencies particularly on the implementation of this incredible legislation that's going to come along. So Congress basically says, provides the broad strokes of what this legislation is intended to achieve, but there's a lot of devil in the details in terms of how you actually get it done, particularly with things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which has a huge amount of tax incentives that are very, very complex. And when you sort of start peeling back the layers, you get into life cycle analysis and energy systems optimization. It really required that kind of thinking. So it was a really amazing opportunity. I just wrapped that up, and I'm still continuing to process this. But I wanted to share with you really some lessons that I took away. And to put this into context, I am incredibly optimistic, more optimistic than ever before. And what I want to share is, thinking about this moment that we're in, knowing that it took 3 decades of incredibly hard work, a huge fight and a struggle to get anybody to even believe climate change was actually happening, to get people to realize that humans were causing climate change and that we needed to act quickly. I mean, that was a huge effort, and people devoted their lives, including Gina and all those other fantastic women mentors that you've heard about. But to me, I think we're at a different moment. If you look at this incredibly consequential legislation that passed through the Congress, bipartisan infrastructure law, bipartisan support. There are people who like lots of this, and I think we're in a time when the fight is a different fight, And to me now, the fight is to get everybody on board and to keep them on board so that we can move at the speed and scale that we're going to need to make progress. So just to tick off some of the important work, you've heard about this, but basically we set climate goals. That was huge, right? We didn't have climate goals, as you heard. We didn't even talk about climate. So aggressive 50 to 52% reduction in greenhouse gases by 2030, zero emission power grid by 2035, and economy-wide net zero by 2050. But there's lots more than that. There was a supply chain executive order almost from day one. I mean, to me, it was really exciting to see that in the first weeks of this presidency, so many things came out that really set the direction for the path that we're on. So economy-wide executive orders starting to understand the critical materials for the energy transition. The government created a sustainability plan. I remember the first time I read it, I was so impressed. It was like the very best of strategic planning you've ever seen on how to use the full power and the procurement power of the government to actually lead by example, and an amazing team of people leading that effort. And of course, the bipartisan infrastructure law with over $25 billion for demonstration projects of technologies that are sort of almost ready to go, and lots of investment in grid and transportation infrastructure so that we can move towards electrical vehicles. And then, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act, which really sweeping opportunities to incentivize private sector actors to participate in the energy transition. And then some new things that are still working their way through the system that I think are also incredibly consequential. So the EPA has developed draft CAFE standards that would drive us towards an increasingly decarbonized transportation sector. And unlike the programs in place now, which are largely incentives, these become regulations. So we have a strategy that in the short run we incentivize, we drive down costs, we begin to get to scale, and then we transition to a regulatory strategy. And this has been developed both for the transportation sector as well as for the electricity sector. So it's all a carefully coordinated strategic approach to making sure we can drive down that path. So a part of this is coming up with a detailed strategy. John Kerry, the Special Envoy for Climate, that focused on international aspects of climate change, and Gina McCarthy, together they worked to develop a long-range strategy. It dealt with the transportation sector, buildings, industry, and electricity. And behind these models, but behind these projections, we're very detailed modeling of economy-wide energy system transitions. So let's take a look at what's in this plan. First of all, it used all the tools in the toolbox towards decarbonization. So starting with something near and dear to your heart, energy efficient buildings, transportation, industry, this just makes the job so much easier. So the more we can push with efficiency, and also I think conservation, lifestyle changes the way that we build our cities, so we can simply use less energy. Second major pillar is decarbonizing electricity, so getting to that zero emission grid by 2035, using a combination of renewables, nuclear, and in particular natural gas with carbon capture and storage. There's little coal in this long-range strategy. And then we need to think about heavy-duty transport, some of what are often called the hard-to-decarbonize or hard-to-decarbonize sectors. So carbon capture and storage and utilization for industry, and hydrogen for long-distance heavy-duty transport, and also for industrial heat. So beyond this, we also have to begin to reduce our non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions. So these are things like methane and refrigerants and so forth that are very, very strong global warming potentials. And then we need to think about our natural and working lands. And right now, they can be a source of emissions into the atmosphere. We want to turn that around. We want to manage our land so we're restoring the soils, restoring ecosystems, and at the same time making them a carbon sink, of actually taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And then finally, the recognition that 2050 is really soon, and if we want to get to net zero, we're going to be having to take some carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere so that we can actually meet that net zero target. So all the tools in the toolbox and a very comprehensive strategy that is very well supported by the opportunities in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act, and then the follow-on regulations that would be created through the Environmental Protection Agency. So that's the backdrop. I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about my favorite graph, because Gina had her 3 sentences that we needed to repeat. Well, this is what I think about every day. So the question is how do we stabilize the climate? And we'd like to stabilize it as at as low a level as possible, a low amount of warming as possible. And for a long time, the climate scientists and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Sciences, it always felt kind of murky. But at some point, they discovered something very, very simple. And that is that the amount of warming that we're going to have depends on the cumulative amount of carbon dioxide emissions we put into the atmosphere. So every little drop of carbon dioxide we put into the atmosphere is going to create a little bit more warming. Okay, so that's that solid line. So it's not only we want to get to net zero, but on the path to net zero, we want to get rid of those emissions as quickly as possible. So during that time we're getting to net zero, we could also be working on limiting the amount of warming that we get. So here we are today. We are at about 1.2 degrees C warming already. This is a daunting and frightening thing. And you can see we have cumulative emissions of about 2,600 gigatons of carbon dioxide. If we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we can put a little more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But if we put any more, temperatures will go up. And if we want to have a 50% probability of limiting warming to 2 degrees C, that we have about 3,800 gigatons that we can put into the atmosphere. So to me, this is what keeps me up at night, is recognizing that every little bit we're putting in is causing more and more trouble. So to put this into perspective, this is the thinking behind this idea of a global carbon budget. And if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C, if we keep emitting at the rate, globally, the rate that we're emitting today, 9 years, and we have blown through that. So it tells us we've got to get to peak emissions as soon as possible. 1.7 degrees C, 17 years, just 17 short years. And 2 degrees C, we have about 30 years if we can keep emitting at today's rate. So this is really, really a short time. We don't have the luxury of waiting till we have the perfect solutions. If you're in a boat and your boat's leaking, well, you do whatever you can to plug that leak. So that's what we need to do. And we already know that climate change is causing devastating effects. I mean, the bad news is that climate change is creating devastating effects. The good news is people have started to see it, and most people believe that most people in the United States and around the world believe climate change is occurring, and they believe that humans are causing it. So that's really helpful. But of course, it's very devastating. And just to, highlight some of the terrible things that have happened recently, including the recent Canadian fires that blanketed the Northeast in smoke. I'm from California, and every year for the past 5 years, we have been blanketed in smoke for most of the summer, like 3 or 4 months, that was very similar to those terrible conditions that we had in June of this year. So really devastating impacts. And it's not just the sort of one-off events like that you can point to, but it's starting to cost us a lot of money. And this is, NOAA has begun to collect this data, and they basically count how many billion-dollar events are we having every year, meaning the damages due to a single climate-related event is $1 billion. And you can see, whereas, a couple decades ago, we had a couple of those a year, now we're up to nearly 20 events per year. And there have been years where we've had almost $500 billion worth of damages in a single year associated with these. So the time to act is now. And again, I think our strategy going forward needs to be, how do we get all hands on deck? How do we enlist more people to help solve this problem instead of pushing people away to say that, no, we're the ones who know how to do this. And not only do we have to have everybody on deck, it doesn't matter if we have them on deck if everybody's rowing in a different direction. So we need to align people's views so that we're all rowing together. And that's what's going to give us the speed and scale that we need to beat those incredibly short timelines that I just showed you. And I want to be really clear. I don't know, your community, but, sometimes I participate in discussions where people don't acknowledge how hard this is. And I personally think this is really hard work. It took us 100 years or more to build the energy system that we have today. And now we're saying that we want to change this in about 20 years. And the energy is about 10% of global economy. So it's really important. So it's not something that's sort of at the edge of our economy and impact on people's lives. It's really central. And so we have a lot of work to do to deal with this. And, so why is it hard? Well, reluctance to change. I mean, even people who, want an EV and want to put in a heat pump and so forth, it's hard, it takes time. You're concerned, is it really going to work? Is it worth the money? And so forth. And then there's real reluctance, like, no, heck no, we're not going to change. So we need to deal with that. And infrastructure, it takes a massive amount of time. I mean, I think of 9 years, 17 years, 30 years. That's really a blink of an eye in infrastructure and in infrastructure years. So we have that to contend with. And enormous investment needs. Yes, the government can put money on it, but we need a multiplier of times that money of 10x or more to be able to get the investment that we need. And we need a workforce who can do this. And finally, we're recognizing now that the energy transition also comes with potentially new national security threats if we build a whole energy system that is dependent almost entirely on international supply chains for components and critical materials. So make no mistake, this is hard work. So what do we want to do? My view is that we need to find a way to make it easier. We don't want to make it so hard. So how do we make it easier? So here are 5 things that I think we can do. The first one is getting more people on board. We don't want half the people. We want 80%, 90% of the people on board. And once we get them on board, we want them to stay on board, right? So we want to keep them enthusiastic and participating. Second thing is that moving from a strategy that relies on individual actions to community scale action for speed and scale. And I know many of you in the room here, that's exactly what you all do. And that's why I loved yesterday. I was so inspired to hear all of you doing exactly this kind of work. But we need to double down on that. And we need to get the financing, and we need to come up with new strategies for how we transform communities, not one house at a time, but blocks at a time and whole cities at a time. Third thing we need to do is identify pragmatic solutions and streamline infrastructure processes. So it's construction, it's permitting, financing, and so forth. So we need to get real. We need to plug that boat. We can't say, oh well, let's go design the perfect plug. It's like, no, let's stop the water from coming in. And related to that is the idea we need to avoid perfect being the enemy of the good. That we just don't have time to find the perfect solution for everything. We need solutions that we can work at now. And we're going to be working on this for the next century. Your children and your children's children are going to continue to participate in the evolution of the energy system and industry more broadly. But we need to get those emissions down by 2050. We need to be at net zero. So let's not have perfect be the enemy of the good. And finally, whoops, sorry about that, we'll go backwards. Yeah, we need to continue to innovate, because I don't think we have all the tools in the toolbox that we need. So let's not focus so much on deploying what we have now at the expense of not continuing to support innovation. And again, I know many of you here are involved in innovation, so thank you. That's really important work. So I just want to dig in on, how do we get people on board, keep people on board. So the first one is, learn and respect other people's priorities. Nobody really likes to be told what to do. We really have to listen to people. And why is it that you are not on board? And what would it take to get you on board? And a corollary to that is to agree on what we're for. A lot of the climate change discussion has been what we're against. We're against this, we're against that. Well, that makes enemies if your whole strategy is being against things. So let's figure out what we're for. And I think everybody wants clean air and clean water. Everybody wants to avoid climate disasters. I don't think those are controversial things. So let's find a language and get people together to focus on what we are all for. And, yes, we might have one strategy that we want to try to accomplish something. Hey, everything should be electric transportation. Well, but maybe somebody says, well, I drive a tractor, or I drive trucks that, we go 1,000 miles, and EVs don't work for me. Okay, well, let's find alternatives. Let's find clean fuel so we can make it work for people. And let's keep the end in mind that our goal is to reduce emissions as fast and as deeply as possible. And sometimes it's going to require making a compromise. It's like, okay, that wasn't my preferred solution, but hey, this one, might get us to scale quicker. Let's go with it. And then finally, incredibly importantly, if this is too expensive, if the price that people are spending for energy gets to eat more and more into their household budgets, we are going to lose people. And just to shine a spotlight on that, in California, I just looked at our utility bill. We're paying peak electricity prices of 50 cents a kilowatt hour, right? The average rate is something like, 8 or 9 cents a kilowatt hour. That doesn't work. That is going to push people away. And if transportation gets to be too expensive, something that's so inelastic, people build transportation is so fundamental to your life. If that's too expensive, we are going to lose people. So let's look for those low-cost solutions. So I was going to actually give you an example. Sorry about this. I'm worried about time. Anyway, so one of the things that I really learned right away when I joined the White House is that we're not just solving for climate. And if you go into a conversation about solving the climate problem and act like that is the only problem, that is the existential problem, I can promise you there's somebody across the table who has another existential problem, which you would agree is existential, unless we deal with that too. So we're solving for climate, absolutely, but we're also solving for environment, clean air, clean water, and environmental justice, the communities that have been exposed for decades. We need recourse. We need to turn that around and make that better for those communities. And if we don't have jobs, if somehow this results in turning jobs that, you get $50 an hour and next thing you know, you've got a $20 an hour job, That's not going to work. It will not be sustainable. Our democracy will fall apart if we don't make sure that we have good jobs for the energy transition. And if we jump into a set of actions that make the U.S. industry lose its economic competitiveness, that is a problem for this country. And finally, national security is important. If we are entirely reliant on other countries, particularly other countries who may not have interests aligned with ours for critical energy technologies, that is going to create problems down the line. And you are not going to get someone on board to participate in solutions. So you need to find those solutions which check all of these boxes, because their equities are very important too. And they're powerful, and they have powerful constituency. So what we need to do is bring together a coalition that deeply respects these different priorities. So moving on to community scale action for speed and scale, people are really busy. People don't want to have to spend a lot of time. People love it that you can flick on a light for electricity, you can go out, get in your car, and people have built their lives around that. So they have other priorities for their time and money. So we need to think about, as we design solutions, honor and respect that. And we need to make it easier and cheaper for people to participate in these programs. And I personally think that finding community scale solutions that don't require individual action is a good approach to helping accomplish that. And also turnkey solutions. My brother is trying to get a heat pump for his house. Oh my God, it is so incredibly hard. In a rural area, almost impossible. So how can we do this? And then we need to get the utilities, support the utilities and public utility commissions to move beyond having a reactive strategy to the changes that are taking place and get on top of it. And anticipating within a decade or so, we are going to have complete transformation of the distribution level systems to accommodate all this electrification. We can't wait one transformer by the next transformer to blow out and then replace it. We need strategic approach to doing this. So next is moving on to identifying pragmatic solutions and streamlined processes. Again, building infrastructure is slow and challenging. And so I think as a starting point, we need to figure out, how can we decarbonize what we have? We can't afford to wait to replace all our buildings. How do we develop workarounds so we can decarbonize the infrastructure that we do have? And we need to identify pragmatic solutions. Like, if you look at a lot of the strategies, they're going to require doubling and tripling the amount of electricity generation we have on the grid. And a lot of that is because it's quite inefficient to have a system built entirely on renewable variable generation. That we need things like clean firm power, and we need very large-scale energy storage so we can make the most efficient use of those fantastic solar and wind resources. And we need to strategically invest in new transmission lines. So just a little example, we don't have time to go into this detail, but today there's a huge queue of solar projects, wind projects. They're ready to begin to be connected to the grid. They're investors who've got the money ready to invest. What used to take less than 2 years, like a year and a half or so, to get a permit to interconnect to the grid, it's now taking 5 years. Right? This is a disaster. We have to find a way to shorten that time period. We don't want to cut corners, but we have to find a way to speed things up. And don't make perfect the enemy of the good. So what do we mean by this? Well, I think a perfect example is if we look at EVs, and if you go back 5-10 years, there are many places, if you switch to an EV, your emissions would be higher. Okay, if you plugged into electricity that was mostly a coal grid, that your overall CO2 emissions would be higher. So you'd say, oh my gosh, that sounds terrible. Well, let's not allow that, right? I mean, we didn't say that. Actually, we had an entirely different view. We said we just need more and more EVs, right? So we need to acknowledge that building up an EV fleet is going to take time, and even if the grid isn't perfectly clean today, it's going to get cleaner and cleaner over time, and what we really need is people to drive EVs, right? So that one, I think we made good choices on. We just incentivized buying EVs. But we're now having the exact same discussion about hydrogen. So hydrogen is a zero-emitting fuel when on the vehicle or in the application. So there's a big debate, like, should we make sure today that hydrogen is perfectly clean so that every little molecule that hydrogen has no emissions? There's actually standards. It has to be like 0.45 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. This is in the law. Should that be our priority? Or should we just try to get more and more hydrogen so we can begin to build the supply chains and the infrastructure and the distribution systems and the way to get hydrogen to the customers? And again, we're having this argument now, but unlike during the time when there were the EV discussion where everyone really just got it, we just need to get more EVs, right now there's a serious debate that I worry deeply is going to slow down hydrogen because we're trying to make it perfect. And that's going to make it really slow. It will make it so we can't use the existing infrastructure that's available. This is highly controversial. I know I probably pissed off half the people in the room here, but it's my view, speed and scale is going to win out because the grid is going to get cleaner and cleaner. That is one of the things I'm less worried about than all of these other changes we need to make. And then finally, we need to continue to innovate. While I was at the Office of White House Science and Technology Policy, we developed a whole of government innovation strategy that looked at all the things that weren't really ready yet to go and deploy at scale, or they just could really benefit from becoming a lot cheaper. We worked with all the agencies to develop the U.S. innovation to meet 2050 goals. And we tried to figure out which of those ones would have the largest impact or transformational impact. And I'm not going to go into this, but it's available. And I would encourage you to take a look and provide feedback to OSTP on that. So just to wrap up and get back to the speed and scale. We have so little time. We need everybody on board. It's not just enough to have us who are all, it's excited to be in the room. We need all the other people. There are equal number of people who aren't yet on deck. And we need to get them on deck, and we need to keep them on deck, and we need to all row in the same direction. So I think it's time to develop fundamentally strategies that acknowledge that there are other priorities for people, and we need to work within those priorities to win no matter what. So thank you very much.